Bill Burns.
Hi.
Good to see you. Welcome back to Aspen.
Thanks. No, it's very nice to be with you and nice to be back at Aspen. Thank you for inviting me again.
You ready? Russia.
Shocked that you would ask that.
What just happened? When you were watching events Saturday, June 24th, what was your understanding of what was unfolding?
Well, I mean, I've seen over the last 3 decades since the end of the Cold War, a lot of fascinating episodes in Russia, but none more fascinating than Prigozhin's mutiny, which was the most direct assault on the Russian state in Vladimir Putin's 23 years in power. I think in many ways it exposed some of the significant weaknesses in the system that Putin has built, weaknesses that already had been laid bare by the disastrous and deeply destructive war that Putin launched 18 months ago in Ukraine. What was remarkable to me, though, was now almost exactly a month ago, today, after Prigozhin launched that mutiny, was the way in which Putin felt compelled to do a deal with his former caterer. And what was equally remarkable, if you look back at the 36 hours that preceded that deal, it began a month ago today in the morning, Russian time, with a 30-minute video that Yevgeny Prigozhin put on Telegram, which is a channel that probably more than a third of the Russian population is active on. And that video was the most scathing indictment of Putin's rationale for war, of the conduct of the war, of the corruption at the core of Putin's regime that I've heard from a Russian or a non-Russian. It was bitterly critical of the conduct of the war by the Russian military leadership, by the defense minister Shoigu and General Gerasimov, the chief of military staff. It took head-on Putin's rationale for war. It said it was built on lies, that there was no imminent threat to the Russian homeland or the Russian people from Ukraine or from NATO. And it was scathing in its description of the corruption which animates the Russian elite today, which is, richly ironic given the fact that Prigozhin himself had profited as much as anyone from that corruption. And so it was quite remarkable to see. And then, of course, what was equally remarkable was the, what transpired in those 36 hours after the video.
And we're going there. You just called it a mutiny. Mm-hmm. Was it an attempted coup? Do we know what Prigozhin was trying to do?
We had President Biden put it succinctly when he said that we knew things ahead of time. And I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. But, Prigozhin, I think, was making some of this up as he went along. Clearly, his main targets were Shoigu and Gerasimov. And a lot of this had been hiding in plain sight, too, because he had been scathing in his public criticisms of both of them. Yeah. So it didn't come as any real surprise when he decided to take action.
How wounded is Putin?
Sorry?
How wounded is Putin?
Well, I think, if you think about, the comment I made before about exposing the weaknesses in Putin's system, what I meant by that is that, Putin in many ways, I think, has constructed his image, which has been carefully cultivated, and his grip on power around the notion and the image that he's the arbiter of order in the Russian system. And what that has meant with the wider Russian public is a kind of social contract in which his message is, you stay out of politics, that's my business. What I will offer in return are rising standards of living, and by and large, I won't get into your personal lives. With the Russian elite, it's been a variant on that social contract, which is, you follow my lead in politics. What I will ensure in return is protection from external threats, protection from one another, and also that everyone gets to feed at the trough, that everybody gets to share in the spoils in what is a deeply corrupt system. And I think, what we've seen, especially in those 36 hours as this mutiny was unfolding, and you had the spectacle of, the Wagner forces, Prigozhin's mercenaries, advancing unopposed into Rostov, which is the city of 1 million people in southern Russia, also the military headquarters of the Russian command in Ukraine, seized control of that, significant city, and then over the following day get 2/3 of the way up the road to Moscow as well. And so, as you think of those two social contracts, what was going through the minds, I think, of a lot of Russians, and what we saw was a Russian security services, Russian military, Russian decision makers, which were adrift, or appeared to be adrift for those 36 hours. So for a lot of Russians watching this, used to this image of Putin as the arbiter of order, the question was, does the emperor have no clothes, or at least why is it taking so long for him to get dressed? And for the elite, I think, what it resurrected was some deeper questions, which again, you've seen circulate within the Russian elite since the war in Ukraine began, since Putin's war in Ukraine began, asking questions about Putin's judgment, about his relative detachment from events, and about his indecisiveness.
Are you seeing fissures? Here in Aspen yesterday, the British Foreign Secretary cleverly said that we're seeing very deep cracks.
Well, I think you're seeing signs of weaknesses in that system, as I put it, and I think those weaknesses have been exposed by Prigozhin's mutiny, but I think even more deeply than that, they've been exposed by Putin's misjudgment since he launched this invasion as well. And I think there's a relationship between the battleground in Ukraine and what's going on inside Russia, in the sense that if and when the Ukrainians make further advances on the battlefield, I think what that's going to do is cause more and more Russians in the elite and outside the elite to pay attention to Prigozhin's critique of the war as well. And so, that's where Putin is trying to buy time. As he considers what to do with Wagner and what to do with Prigozhin himself, Putin hates, in my experience anyway, the image that he's overreacting to things. So he's trying to settle things, but I think what he's going to try to do is separate Prigozhin from what's of value to Putin and Wagner, because they have borne the brunt of the fighting in the Battle of Bakhmut over most of the last year, suffered the brunt of the casualties there. 80% of the Wagner forces in the Battle of Bakhmut were recent residents of Russian penal colonies. They're useful to Putin in Africa and Libya and in Syria. So I think what he's going to try to do is separate Prigozhin and undercut him, but preserve what's of value to him as well.
President Biden recently said of Prigozhin, "If I were he, I'd be careful what I ate." He also said we're not even sure where he is. Do you know where he is? You saw this video that emerged that seemed to show him in Belarus. Is it real?
Yeah, no, he's moved around a bit.
Yeah.
I think he's been in Minsk lately. I'm not sure he has any plans to retire in the suburbs of Minsk, but he spent time in Russia as well. And I think, what we're seeing is a very complicated dance between Prigozhin and Putin. I think Putin is someone who generally thinks that revenge is a dish best served cold. So he's going to try to settle the situation to the extent he can. But again, in my experience, Putin is the ultimate apostle of payback. So I would be surprised if Prigozhin escapes further retribution for this. So in that sense, the president's right. If I were Prigozhin, I wouldn't fire my food taster.
What about General Surovikin? How much freedom of movement does he currently enjoy?
Oh, I don't think a lot right now. I don't think he enjoys a lot of freedom right now.
The CIA has taken this opportunity to make your first video post telegram to let brave Russians know how to contact us safely on the dark web. Have they?
We had 2.5 million views of that telegram video in the first week it was on. So the truth is there's a lot of disaffection in Russia, in the elite and outside it in Russia right now, and we're not wasting the opportunity as an intelligence service to try to take advantage of it.
MI6 says they're also trying to recruit off this. Is there a friendly rivalry to get in there first?
It's aimed at the same objective right now too.
And as part of the objective, whether that leads to useful intelligence streams for you, to make Putin look over his shoulder, uneasy about who he can trust?
Well, I think Putin is already a little bit uneasy as he looks over his shoulder. I think that's true, and the debate that goes on within the Russian elite right now. And so it would be crazy for us not to take advantage of what is, in effect, a once-in-a-generation opportunity as a human intelligence service to take advantage of that.
Yeah. You were just in Ukraine. How is the big counteroffensive going? What's your assessment?
Well, I'm a pretty regular travel to Ukraine, over the course of the last 18 months, and that's a reflection of the significance that the president, everyone in the U.S. government attaches to our support for what has been an incredibly courageous and tenacious Ukrainian effort to fight back against Putin and against Russia. Putin was fond of saying that Ukraine's not a real country. Well, real countries fight back. And that's just what President Zelensky and my intelligence counterparts in the Ukrainian military have done. I don't think it should come as a surprise to anyone that the counteroffensive is a hard slog. Offense is a lot harder than defense. The Russians have had months to prepare not only fixed defenses in Zaporizhia in southern Ukraine, but also quite thick and extensive minefields as well. So it's going to take time, and it's not going to be easy to make progress. I am, however, an optimist, not based on those trips, not only based on those trips to Ukraine, but on the intelligence that we're able to acquire and develop, that the Ukrainians will be able to make advances. And I think the thing sometimes that it's easy to forget is that behind those considerable fixed defenses that the Russians have built in southern Ukraine and Zaporizhia, there still lies some pretty significant structural weaknesses, poor morale, uneven generalship, to put it mildly, on the Russian side, and the disarray we were just talking about in the political and very senior military leadership. So I think it is going to be a tough slog, but we're going to do everything we can as an intelligence agency to provide the kind of intelligence support and sharing that's going to help the Ukrainians to make progress.
One thing that feels important to ask about, because we seem to be talking about it less, it's less in the news, is the possibility of a nuclear weapon being introduced in the war zone. I know that late last year you met with your Russian counterpart, Sergei Naryshkin, and you have described that your orders were from President Biden to make very clear what the consequences would be if Russia were to go down that path. I mean, it suggests that President Biden thought the possibility was real enough that he dispatched his CIA chief to make sure it didn't happen. Are you more or less worried about that now than a year ago?
Well, I'd say several things. First, the nuclear saber rattling that Putin and some of those around him have engaged in is reckless and deeply irresponsible. It is, however, not something we can take lightly. We do not see today any concrete preparations for the potential use of nuclear weapons. We have made absolutely clear in that conversation with Sergei Naryshkin, one of my Russian counterparts, and through other channels, the depth of our concern. I think it's been important that President Xi in China has spoken out about this as well, because his is a voice that's difficult for the Kremlin to ignore right now. So it's something that we obviously monitor very, very carefully. But as I said, we don't see any immediate signs of preparations for nuclear use.
How much more instability has it just introduced to have Russia pull out of the grain deal and increasingly expanding its attacks on the Black Sea?
Well, it's deeply troubling. First for Ukrainians, where, what Putin is trying to do is wreck the Ukrainian economy and wreak real havoc on innocent Ukrainian civilians. It obviously also does deep damage to some of the most vulnerable societies on Earth in Africa and the Middle East that depend on those grain shipments. What Putin is engaged in clearly just over the last several days is a very systematic effort. It's not just about pulling out of the grain deal, it's also about 3 nights in a row of intensive attacks in Odessa and Mykolaiv and other port cities against grain storage facilities. And as the White House made clear earlier today, we see some very concerning signs of the Russians considering the kind of false flag operations that we highlighted in the run-up to the war as well. In other words, looking at ways in which they might make attacks against shipping in the Black Sea and then blaming it or trying to blame it on the Ukrainians.
Why is Iran arming Russia in Ukraine?
Because I think the defense partnership between Russia and Iran right now is a useful two-way street.
What's Iran getting?
Well, I think, we've seen signs of the Russian technicians working on the space launch vehicle program in Iran, other aspects of their missile programs. We've seen discussion, at least, of the possibility of the Russians providing advanced combat aircraft to Iran, which expands the threat from the innocent Ukrainian civilians. And I've seen this on my own visits to Kyiv when Shahed 136s and other armed Iranian drones have been used indiscriminately against Ukrainian civilians. But, the provision of advanced combat aircraft obviously creates threats to our friends in the region as well. So it's a two-way street, and in many ways that's what's most troubling about that defense partnership.
Speaking of cracks, speaking of fissures, your counterpart at MI6, Richard Moore, just gave an interview this week in which he suggested that the drones are causing internal turmoil in Iran. His quote was, "Iran's decision to supply Russia with suicide drones has provoked internal quarrels at the highest level of the regime in Tehran." You seeing that?
Yeah, I'm not going to add to what Richard said in terms of our commentary on intelligence we collect about what's going on inside the Iranian leadership. We have, however, seen signs, and some of this has been public, where the Iranian leadership has hesitated about supplying ballistic missiles to the Russians, which, was also on their wish list as well, partly because they're concerned not just about our reaction, but about European reaction as well.
No. China. President Xi, as you know, has instructed his country's military to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. What's your assessment of whether he will?
Well, I think, it's been discussed publicly a lot, that instruction to be ready by 2027. I think it means just that, to be ready. It doesn't mean that conflict is imminent or inevitable.
Has he made up his mind, one way or the other?
I'm not sure that he has. And I think what it means is that today, President Xi and the PLA, the People's Liberation Army leadership, have doubts about whether they could pull off a successful, full-scale invasion of Taiwan at acceptable cost to them. And I think, no foreign leader, I think, has paid more careful attention to Putin's experience in Ukraine than President Xi has as he thinks about Taiwan. And I think that's probably reinforced some of those doubts, too. Not only the way in which an objectively smaller military has had incredible success in fighting back with a great deal of motivation against a bigger military, but also some of the flaws in Russian weapon systems. The fact that I think certainly Putin, but I think also President Xi underestimated the speed with which President Biden would be able to put together a strong coalition in support of Ukraine, the solidarity of the West in being willing to accept some economic costs to inflict damage on Russia. So all of that, I think, gives pause to the Chinese leadership. But having said all that, I don't think any of us at CIA or in the US intelligence community underestimate President Xi's commitment eventually to try to control Taiwan.
Do you have a sense of what would trigger it, what the red lines would be?
There are all sorts of things, unfortunately, given the state of relations that could trigger that kind of movement. But today, I think, our effort as a government, and here this is a policy issue, not an intelligence one, is to do everything we can under the Taiwan Relations Act to help Taiwan defend itself, but also to make clear in policy channels at the same time that, we're not interested in changing the status quo right now across the Taiwan Strait, and we oppose any unilateral efforts to change that. We don't support Taiwan independence, but, we've made very clear in policy channels that we would very sharply oppose any use of force by the People's Republic of China to try to alter that status quo.
If China were to make the decision to invade, would you have the same heads up from intelligence sources that you did when Vladimir Putin made up his mind to invade Ukraine?
Well, it's something we obviously work very hard at. I'm proud of the record of CIA and the wider US intelligence community in providing credible, accurate early warning on Putin's plans to invade Ukraine. That's why the president sent me to Moscow in November of 21, months before the war, to lay out in what was a kind of unusual step what we knew about his plans and what the consequences would be. So we worked very hard as an agency with all our partners in the intelligence community to put ourselves in as strong a position as we can to advise the president and policymakers, if that day ever comes, of what we see being planned.
I'm going to push you on this because about a decade ago, the China rolled up a lot of CIA operations in China. A dozen or more CIA sources were arrested or worse, executed. Have you rebuilt?
Yeah, we've made progress and we're working very hard over recent years to ensure that we have a strong human intelligence capability to complement what we can acquire through other methods.
On the cyber front, the recent Chinese hack of US government accounts, email accounts, Microsoft says it went undetected for a month. Was this Chinese intelligence?
Well, I mean, I would say several things. First, I mean, it was the US government, as the White House had made clear, that I think first detected those hacks, informed Microsoft, which acted, very efficiently in response to that. Microsoft has attributed this to China, and we don't have any reason to doubt that attribution.
But I mean, officially sanctioned? Was this Chinese intelligence or?
I can't go beyond what I just said.
Was it within the realm of what is normal tit for tat? We know the Chinese are going to try to spy on the US. Or did you see it as an escalation?
Well, I think, the efforts not just of the People's Republic of China, but Russia, Iran, North Korea, and others to hack US systems, US critical infrastructure have been going on for some years. So in that sense, it's not new, but it's something we take very seriously. And CIA's role as a foreign intelligence agency is to collect all the intelligence we can and then support the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI and others, who are properly focused on protecting the United States' domestic issues.
Yeah. Why do US government accounts keep getting hacked? Why can't we protect them better?
All I can do is speak for the CIA, and we work very hard to protect, accounts there, and we work very hard with other agencies, both domestic and other intelligence agencies, to ensure that, we're not only sharply focused on these issues, but we're sharing every bit of intelligence we can acquire that will help us not only better protect US government, unclassified accounts, because this is what we're talking about, not classified accounts in the case of the most recent hack, but, also trying to do all we can to strengthen our cybersecurity.
How are you feeling about election security in 2024?
Something we take very seriously. I mean, again, as a foreign intelligence service, I don't doubt either the capacity or the determination of some of our rivals and adversaries to try to create problems, whether it's through disinformation or other means in our election processes. I think the interagency cooperation on those issues is a lot stronger than it was in 2016, even in 2020.
Are you seeing like red warning lights though, the way in hindsight we should have before 2016?
No, we're trying to anticipate a lot of those concerns right now so we don't get to the point of, red warning lights as well. We've organized ourselves at CIA with a new mission center, which is, one of the organizational building blocks, a dozen or so of them at CIA, that's focused on a range of issues, both transnational and technological issues that I think help us be a better partner for other US government agencies.
Yeah. I know you don't do politics. I know the CIA's mission is foreign focused, foreign threats. But I wonder if the line feels awfully blurry someday. What is the CIA's role if the greatest threat to our security is our domestic politics?
Well, we're a foreign intelligence agency, not a domestic one. But what we have tried to do is organize ourselves in a way where we can contribute to that better interagency coordination. Because you're right, the truth is, and I think Ali Mayorkas, who was here earlier today, expressed it well, that given the challenges we face, sometimes the lines between domestic and foreign get blurred. the lines in terms of our responsibilities aren't blurred. We know who we are. We're a foreign intelligence service. But what that means is that we have to work even harder and work even more effectively to ensure that what intelligence we collect in our role gets shared quickly and effectively with our domestic law enforcement partners. And I think we're doing better at that than we have in years past.
Yeah. I mean, do you, Bill Burns, personally agree with that premise? I think Richard Haas of the now President Emeritus of Council on Foreign Relations has expressed this. The greatest threat to our national security is us.
I mean, the only thing I can say on that is, I travel a lot, and I get the question from lots of foreign counterparts, whether it's political leaders or intelligence partners, is they ask questions and they wonder sometimes about what appears to them, at least, to be our domestic dysfunction. So, as a matter of intelligence assessment, I'd be crazy if I said that doesn't enter into the equation with some of our foreign partners.
What do you tell them? What's your answer?
What I try to do is, the great advantage of democratic systems, in my experience as a citizen, not just as director of the CIA, is that for all of our faults, we're pretty good at addressing them and fixing those flaws, I think better than authoritarian systems are as well. Now, the proof is obviously in the actions we take, and not every action we take reassures people about that as a society. But I think that's the best, and I think the most honest answer to those kind of challenges. And then in our role as an intelligence service, we try to demonstrate that we're an apolitical institution, and that what we're committed to is serving the best interests of the American people and building intelligence partnerships that they can rely on and that they can trust, our foreign partners.
You spent 32 years in the diplomatic service, and then you took over CIA 2021, so like 2.5 years ago. You inherited an agency whose officers had been maligned by their commander-in-chief, who suggested he believed Vladimir Putin over his own spy chiefs. Has the damage been repaired?
I think, first I would say my predecessor, Gina Haspel, deserves a great deal of credit for shielding the apolitical institution that the men and women of the CIA are proud to be a part of from, a lot of the criticisms and the challenges that came in the last administration. And, you'd have to ask my colleagues, but what I am is deeply proud of the work that our officers do. I mean, as we sit here this evening in very hard places, doing very hard jobs around the world, the risks that they take and the sacrifices that they make, not widely understood, nor should they be publicly. But I'm deeply proud of that, and I think our officers take great pride in that as well. And so that's what I work very hard at every day.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk about the CIA as an apolitical institution, that's, when you go testify on the Hill before Jane Harman's old committee, the traditional thinking has been intelligence is too important to be politicized. And yet, through no fault of the many fine men and women serving at the CIA, the intelligence has been politicized. How do you think about that? And particularly in this moment leading up to what is about to be another toxic election cycle.
Well, my obligation, and President Biden reminds me of this frequently, is to offer the best intelligence that we can collect and analyze straight up, even when that's inconvenient to policymakers. And I've spent enough time on the other side of the table to know when it's inconvenient too, when somebody's telling you that your big new idea is actually not so big, not so new, and not so effective. Our job is to be straight about that, whether it's welcome downtown at the White House or other parts of the executive branch or not. It's not an easy role to play, but it's an incredibly important one. It's one I take seriously. I know Director Haynes does, and others across the U.S. intelligence community. Yes. And that's what our officers do their very best to provide.
So I want to draw everyone's attention to a recent New York Times headline, for those who missed it. The headline on May 9th was, "William Burns, a CIA spy master with unusual powers."
My daughter's got a big kick out of that. Yeah.
The most memorable line to my reading, and I'm curious what yours was the description of you as, and I quote, a tall, discreet figure with wary eyes, ashen hair, and a trim mustache. A sort you could easily imagine in a John le Carré novel whispering into a dignitary's ear at an embassy party that the city is falling to the rebels and a boat will be waiting in the harbor at midnight.
I am tall.
Have you ever had occasion to whisper in a dignitary's ear that a boat will be waiting in the harbor at midnight? Or do you aspire to that?
It's something to aspire to, right? I'm a big Le Carré fan too, but yeah.
I mean,
I think that's a vastly exaggerated.
Were you tickled when you read that? Did they get it right?
Tickled may not be the right word. Yeah, yeah.
Is there any aspect of your job that's fun?
Yeah, fun's a strong term in this job. But I genuinely do enjoy it. I mean, it's, I genuinely enjoy the women and men I work with. As I said, I'm very proud of them. I learn something new every day. I'm a curious person, and certainly in the world of intelligence, there's lots of new things to learn every day. I'm concerned, about my colleagues. I worry about all those people doing hard jobs in hard places, taking incredible risks as well. But I feel like we're performing an important service, for our government and for our nation, and we work very hard at it as well. So while not every day is fun, some days have a little bit of fun in them, I genuinely enjoy what I'm doing, and I'm very proud of the work that my colleagues are doing.
Does it look different? I mean, I mentioned you spent 3 decades in the Foreign Service. You knew every world leader. You'd already dealt with them. You had, if you were trying to design a crash course for the incoming CIA director to understand the world, you'd taken the course. You would be teaching.
Especially with some of the creepier leaders. Yes, that's true.
I believe you once said Gaddafi was the creepiest. Is he still top of the list?
Yeah, it's a tight competition, but yes.
Who's number 2?
I don't know. Okay. Gaddafi was in a class by himself.
But I do wonder, knowing the world, knowing the issues and the people and the geography so well, does it look different from Langley than it does from Foggy Bottom? The mission is fundamentally different, or is it?
It is. No, it is fundamentally different. I mean, my role now, our role at CIA is to support policymakers. It's not to be a policymaker, and that's something my colleagues and I understand very clearly. But part of our job, just as it is for diplomats, is to understand and navigate some very complicated foreign landscapes as well, and using foreign languages, using an understanding of history and culture. And, in that sense, there's some overlap, at least in the skill sets that are required. The professions themselves are complementary in some ways, but fundamentally different too. And so, as I said, that's one of the things I've enjoyed most, is learning something new about a profession that I thought in all those years, almost 3.5 decades as a career diplomat, I understood pretty well, because I worked very closely with CIA colleagues serving overseas, and I know the intelligence they collected and the analysis they provided made me a better negotiator, a better ambassador, a better diplomat. And I'd like to think that my experience on the policy side of the table and as a diplomat makes me well equipped to understand what matters most to policymakers, and therefore to make sure that we're providing at the pace that it's required the kind of intelligence that's going to make the biggest difference to smart policy choices.
Yeah. I think there's many people in this room who have stressful, intense, relentless jobs. Very few of us who have been dispatched by the President of the United States to tell Russia, you may not use a nuclear weapon. This cannot happen. The consequences, if you don't do a good job in being persuasive, are unimaginable. How do you carry that responsibility, that weight?
Don't dwell too much on what you just mentioned. I mean, you try to focus on the challenge at hand, and I mean, that's one place where having a lot of experience over the years does pay off. I trust the people I work with to help put me in the strongest position to deliver messages like that. And, I try to be as professional as I can be in delivering what the president asked me to deliver.
Do you get scared before you walk into a meeting like that?
No, not scared. There were times earlier in my career when I'd be lying to you if I said I wasn't anxious about things. But I've been at it long enough when, I just try to focus on the challenge or the mission at hand.
We have just a couple minutes left, and I want to use it to try to figure out what we should be focused on that we are not. I've just run through the laundry list of things that I would be, the top. I'm going to start with Russia. I'm going to ask you about Iran. I'm going to ask you about China. We're going to go to the war in Ukraine. We're going to talk cyber. Is there a country, a person, a place, an issue that journalists never ask you about that we should?
I mean, I think as a government, and sometimes as an agency, we don't pay enough attention to the continent of Africa as we should. This is, a part of the world that's only going to become more significant for American interests as the years flow by. The population of the continent of Africa is likely to double before the middle of this century. If you add to that all the unresolved problems of food, water, health and security, the impact of climate change, unresolved regional conflicts, bad governance in some places, corruption in some of those places, the way in which predatory players like the Wagner Group, Prigozhin's mercenaries, try to take advantage of that. It's a challenge that we can't afford to neglect. I've traveled several times to Africa in my role as director of CIA. I worked very hard to try to provide the support and the resources that our officers operating in Africa need and can make best use of. We were reminded, I remember late last April, when a political crisis accelerated rapidly in Sudan, the kind of challenges that matter enormously to the people of Sudan, which has suffered more than its share of humanitarian catastrophes over the years, but can spill over and deepen, regional insecurity as well. So that's an area where, I try to stay, as sharply focused as I can, and our agency does too. So that's one example at least. I think, broader than that, broader than the geopolitical part of the question, is just the revolution in technology. And we've already talked about that a little bit, and I know
we need another hour if we're
going
to
AI. And the forum is focused on that. But I think, how well or how poorly we take advantage of emerging technologies as an agency, not just in helping policymakers to understand vulnerabilities in supply chains and a whole range of other issues, but also transforming our own tradecraft to take advantage of those changes and stay ahead of our adversaries, is really going to make or break us as a professional intelligence service. So that's something we are also very sharply focused on, which may not have been the case a decade ago.
Send us out into the evening with a word of advice. We have a great young leaders program at the Security Forum. Young people in their 20s who are considering or are already launched into careers in public service, in the government, in the military, and academia. What would you tell 25-year-old Bill Burns? What do you wish you'd known?
Yeah, well, I remember what my dad wrote to me when I was 25 years old, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my professional life, and one possibility was going into the Foreign Service. And I remember my dad wrote me a letter, which is kind of quaint, but that's what people did in those days. And one line has always stuck with me. He said, "Nothing can make you prouder than to serve your country with honor." He was a career Army officer, of whom I am deeply proud. And, that swayed me a little bit at the time. I never expected 4 decades later to still be in public service. But, throughout all of those 40 years, every year, every job I've had, I've learned the truth in those words of advice. And so what I say to any 25-year-olds out there is, public service, I think, is always going to have its challenges, especially in the Foreign Service or in the CIA. If you're moving back and forth overseas, it poses challenges to families. You can ask my 2 daughters who are in their, early 30s now, changing high schools when you're 15 or 16 is not a lot of fun. And there are a lot of risks that people have to take. But I wouldn't have traded it for anything. I think the opportunity to serve your country and to try to do it with honor as best you can, I think is something that I would urge all the 25-year-olds out there to consider. We had a banner year in recruitment at CIA this past year, the biggest number of applicants since the immediate aftermath of 9/11. So I'd encourage all of you to consider that as well, or any other form of public service.
And also a boat is waiting in the harbor at midnight. Bill Burns, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've stuck with us on a tour around the world. I'm only going to take 30 seconds of your time.